Hi, my guest today is Ian Thomas. Ian has worked in senior roles running data organizations and most recently in a series of chief data officer roles. One of the things that is unique about Ian is that he has worked in digital media on both sides of the industry. He has worked on the sell side at companies like Microsoft and on the buy side at companies like Publicis. He also brings different perspectives, having worked in both the United States and where he is now in the United Kingdom on digital media problems. So we're going to get into some of those different perspectives today. Ian, thank you so much for taking the time to talk.
Well, thanks for inviting me, James. It's great to have the chance to chat.
Excellent. Now, Ian, let's start with some of the basics of the publisher side analytics, since that's where you and I first crossed paths. When I think about publisher analytics, I always think there are two main work streams or categories. One is, what are consumers doing on publisher properties? And then the second different stream is, how are advertisers performing on those properties? Are those the two main buckets you think about, or do you use a different organizing framework when you're talking about publisher side problems?
Yeah, I think those are two very important areas for sure. And publishers, particularly for a long time, have been interested in the consumption of content on their sites and how people are navigating through the sites and so on. And as you say, understanding how they are monetizing that inventory. And I think those two things are coming together a little bit at the moment, with publishers really focusing on building a more holistic understanding of their audiences. And when we say the word audiences, to most people, that kind of makes people think of big cookie pools and tracking people at the individual level, and plenty of thoughts about about the future of that, which we'll probably come on to. But there's also the opportunity now for publishers to understand their audiences in kind of a more holistic sense, joining together first-party data they may contribute around their interests and their own kind of profile information. The rise in subscription-based business models in publishing, I think, is partly driven by that. But then there's also publishers really understanding better the sentiment and kind of context of what their audiences are actually consuming. And of course, that's not just, or it's moving on from the days of saying, oh, okay, people were looking at current affairs content or information about cars or information about celebrities, these sort of simple categorizations, into more granular understanding of the topics and the interests, and starting to use that to build new pictures and new ways of thinking about their audiences that they can then turn around and attempt to sell to advertisers. So I think it's a really interesting time to be a publisher, and hopefully a better time to be a publisher than it has been for the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a minute, because I think publishers both face a unique set of challenges and opportunities around data and analytics. But let's flip for a minute, because you then moved to the agency side after you left Microsoft. You spent time at Publicis and other agencies. When you made that transition from the sell side to the buy side, what did you see as the main differences and sort of the problems and challenges that the agencies are facing around data and analytics?
Well, yeah, it was super interesting to move into the agency world. I got a little bit of a taste of that actually while I was still at Microsoft, because one of my later roles there was building and running a large-scale customer data platform for the Microsoft consumer business, and so we were working hand in hand with our agency partners on that work, which was supporting a lot of relationship marketing. And one of the things that was interesting to observe and to experience, both at Microsoft and then later, was that a lot of agencies still kind of operate on the outside when it comes to data with their clients. So there's the kind of agency world of building and running an ad tech platform, capturing data from various sources, trying to use that to target ads, and then using that data to understand the performance of that ad or those campaigns. But a lot of that is still very much in its own little silo, and agencies still struggle, and certainly 2-3 years ago when I was doing some of this work with publicists, they still struggle to kind of cross that the Rubicon of actually getting real partnership with their clients to share the data that they need to really drive performance and understand performance. Agencies are still kind of held at arm's length, and so you see a lot of that in these these holdcos these days, of agencies trying to extend their value proposition. The time I spent at Omnicom, for example, I was working for Omnicom's in-house consulting arm, which was explicitly about helping the agencies cross that barrier. And it was a real challenge because the clients were not used to buying that different kind of service. And then the other thing that's interesting about agencies is they're very audience-based again, and that a lot of that is driven by a lot of the buying behaviors of their clients. And so I was involved with various pitches at Publicis, for example, where essentially the major client ask was like, tell me how I can find my audiences out on the open internet. What tools can you bring? And so Publicis created the tool People Cloud, which is now part of Epsilon post that acquisition. Omnicom has Omni, a similar offering, which are really about aggregating third-party audience data to try and provide that targeting capability. But again, with the way the industry's going, I'm not sure that's as an approach is going to have sort of a lot of legs in the medium term, unless some of that audience methodology really changes, and agencies can kind of get inside the tent with their clients, which I think some of them are achieving and some of them are having less success at.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, even though it's the same industry, very different types of problems on the two different sides of the industry. Hey, internet companies are famous for pioneering the use of big data technologies like Hadoop and Hive, simply because of the volume of data that is generated in the internet space. One of the concerns that I had when I ran a data team was that with so much data availability, teams can get distracted by pursuing analyses that I'd put in the category of interesting, but not necessarily impactful. So to that end, how, as you've managed big data teams, do you ensure that with so much data, the right questions are being asked by the organization overall?
Well, I mean, I've seen the same thing that you have, and it was a major feature of the kind of the COVID years that a lot of organizations took the time to invest heavily in big data platforms. A lot of data lakes got implemented, a lot of data got dumped in those data lakes, and then in many cases, sort of data scientists were hired and told to kind of just go fish, really, in those lakes, with the kind of hope that they would just sort of emerge from their darkened cave at some point and go, I've come up with this amazing insight or algorithm that's going to make us $10 million or something, and that really just doesn't happen. And I think the big tech firms, not deliberately, I don't really hold them kind of accountable for this, but they've inadvertently set a kind of a terrible example to the rest of the world, because they have problems that they need to hire large numbers of data scientists to do high-end work to solve, whereas most organizations have more sort of workaday needs, not all of which have to be solved with data science in the first place. And the starting point, as you'll be unsurprised to hear, is sitting down and figuring out what business problems you're trying to solve in the first place, and thinking inclusively about what might solve a business problem. So, we were talking just a minute ago about the advertisers and publishers and what they're trying to solve. Advertisers are trying to solve the problem of driving the best response rate or ROI or ROAS on the money they're spending on advertising. That's what they're trying to solve for. They're not trying to solve for particular kind of targeting or a particular kind of algorithm or whatever. They're trying to drive value, and so really sitting down and asking those questions up front of what kind of problems you're trying to solve, and then thinking, okay, what's the easiest way we can solve that problem? One of the challenges with this sort of this rush to big data and data science is that somebody in the room would be like, oh, I could use a convolutional neural network to solve that. So yeah, sure, you could, but I've just got a little piece of basic business logic which will solve it 80% as well for 1/100th of the cost. And so it's really about sitting down, thinking about what business problems we're trying to solve, and setting goals and committing to those goals ahead of time. And at Microsoft, actually, we spent quite a lot of time working on exec education to help our senior execs frame problems in a way that could be helped with data. A lot of senior execs still kind of basically do what they want to do, and then just set data teams to, kind of find the answer that the thing they did solve the problem they thought they were going to get. And so senior execs need to be really honest with themselves about what they're trying to achieve and actually commit to those outcomes.
Ian, I could not agree with you more. It's one of these things where everybody feels like they need a data team. Let's go quickly hire one and work out what they're going to do later. And so just as you've been talking, I want to go slightly in a direction I hadn't intended, which is where a data team should sit within an organization. Let's stay on the publisher side, because we talk big data, and Facebook and Google and others are famous for their use of big data teams. In your experience, is it more successful to have one big centralized data team where you centralize all the skills and knowledge, and then have them act as a service provider to the rest of the company, so that there's actually some eyes on the consistency of approach, etc.? Or is it generally more effective to have sort of decentralized teams where your marketing team might have their own data team, data and analytics, you might have your consumer insights team have their own data and insights team, etc., and maybe you have an overlay team who sort of manages the processes amongst all these different federations? But what have you seen? I mean, you could argue that either of those models works, but what have you seen be more successful in practice?
Well, yeah, it's a really good question. And it very much depends on the level of data maturity within the organization. So the conversation I most often have around this topic is to explain to people that this whole thing is a journey. And so an organization, if somebody came to me, a client comes to me and says, we don't really have any kind of data function, and we don't really know what we're doing with this stuff, I will probably recommend to them that they create a fairly centralized data team, because they need to create the shortest path possible between building out platform capabilities, not just technology platform, but data platform capabilities, building out a good data foundation for doing analytics and so on, and a short path between that and the people who are actually going to use that data. So having a data team which is combination of some data engineers, architects, some analysts, maybe a data scientist at some point, et cetera, all working closely together is a really great way to get started. As the organization matures, then it becomes, I think it's desirable, actively desirable actually, to explicitly have the sort of orientation in your thinking that particularly the analytics work will at some point become somewhat decentralized, because a central data team, and it's a very common problem, central data team is serving the needs of multiple different stakeholders within the organization. Those stakeholders don't really care about each other. It's kind of not their job to care about each other. They've got their own jobs to do. Finance doesn't necessarily care about marketing, doesn't necessarily care about product, and so on. Except in the broader, sort of kumbaya, we're all part of one big company thing. But in terms of what they need today, they've got their own needs, and so a central team is always eventually going to struggle just prioritizing the conflicting needs of different teams, and you end up with ring-fenced resources and stuff, and that can get you so far. But eventually that leads to be able to say, okay, look, marketing, if you've got, if you want to do more and more with this data, how about you hire some analysts yourselves, and we will provide the foundation. We will support you and train the analysts and so on. Maybe we'll lend you somebody for a while, but we'll get you to become more self-sufficient in what you're doing. So the data team becomes more of a foundational service provider and kind of center of excellence to the rest of the organization as they become, and this kind of decentralization is typically highly asymmetric. So, some teams are quite self-sufficient while other teams are very much not. And there's a scale aspect because there's some small team and you say, all you have to do is hire a whole person to do analytics. They're like, we ain't got the budget for a whole person. So you may end up having to kind of maybe support those, those people centrally. But really thinking about a federated model in due course. Some organizations have multiple data teams because they have multiple sources of data. Microsoft was a crazy big example of that because the big product organizations were generating a lot of their own data, a ton of their own data, and had their own fully formed data teams. And so there you had a central team or a series of central teams which were just trying to kind of coordinate. But that's, again, Microsoft is not a great example because it's one of the big tech firms. Most organizations are very much more towards the sort of the lower maturity end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Changing directions a little bit, there has been a lot of talk at the moment about privacy and the death of third-party cookies. I mean, this is a huge topic, but how do you think that this will impact advertisers and publishers, both in their ability to collect the data that they need and their ability to use that data effectively, whether it's in targeting or optimization or in other methods?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it, actually, weirdly. I don't know about you, but I got pretty sick of being followed around the internet by, that sofa I looked at on a website 3 weeks ago. And I feel like the whole rise, it's a really interesting example actually of, there's some MBA thesis somewhere in here about what happens in a sort of an unregulated market where, the market is moving, sort of up a trajectory at some point, but is that the right overall direction for it to go in? Because the easy availability of third-party tracking technologies, plus the rise of the big walled garden providers of Google and Meta, has really kind of hollowed out a big part of kind of media planning and buying over the last 5 to 10 years. As we were sort of touching on earlier, it's impoverished a lot of publishers in the open internet, have them cede a ton of control over a ton of knowledge about their audience to third parties like Meta. And it's not created a great experience for consumers. The number of times I've been on what I consider to be a reasonably prestigious publisher site, and I scroll down to the bottom of an article and find myself in kind of taboola hell where there's all these low relevancy ads that apparently are targeted to my cookie, which are not adding to the experience. So.
Let me interrupt you because you're actually going in a different direction than I thought, and I think I would have a very different perspective. So I want to understand yours. I had this discussion with someone you and I both know actually yesterday, where we were talking about who was likely to be the beneficiaries of cookies going away. And my perspective, which I think sounds different than yours, is the people who always win will win again. Meta, Google, etc., walled gardens, they're big, they've got the scale. And I use the analogy that I think this is just like GDPR was in Europe 3-4 years ago, where well-meaning regulators put these rules in place, not realizing that many mid-sized publishers wouldn't have the capabilities, the scale to be able to compete with the big guys. And so I think what I'm hearing from you is you actually think that this could be something that gives a competitive advantage to some of those mid-sized publishers against the walled gardens. And clearly I'm coming at it from a different place. So help me understand the rationale of why the walled gardens may be more negatively impacted than, say, a mid-sized publisher.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't count them out for sure. I think there's been a lot of chatter about what Google, for example, is doing with Privacy Sandbox, and will it just accrue more more power to Google. One of the big champions in that fight actually is the Competition and Markets Authority here in the UK, who are very closely scrutinising what's going on there to make sure that it doesn't create additional competitive advantage for Google. So I think that the walled gardens will still be strong. Where I think there's an opportunity for publishers is to work with third parties that are able to leverage deep contextual understanding of publisher content to create value that the publisher can potentially own themselves. It's their content, the semantic understanding of it to be something that they create to enable things like contextual targeting and sort of synthetic audiences based upon behaviors that historically publishers haven't been able to do because the technology hasn't been there and hasn't really been the incentive. It's been too easy for advertisers just to spend their money with the walled gardens, and buy buy sort of cheap, undifferentiated inventory that just happens to be kind of be well targeted, particularly sort of publisher networks for things like Meta. So as I say, I don't think I wouldn't count Google and Meta out. I'm just seeing some interesting emerging players, players like Teads and CTAG that are really offering some interesting targeting capabilities that I think will be very interesting to third-party publishers. And this is relying a lot on the use of our new best friend, generative AI, to create that contextual understanding, and then do other things like bring in campaign optimization and so on, which really benefits the advertisers.
So that's actually where I wanted to go. Let's talk about that a bit. When cookies are getting deprecated, identifiers are potentially being impacted. You see generative AI as one of the main techniques for sort of offsetting some of the decline that advertisers might see in their ROAS, or that publishers may see in their yield. You're optimistic, it sounds like, about the ability for AI to create new techniques or new segmentation methodologies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's some interesting things. So there's two major areas that I'm excited about in driving campaign performance in this new world. One I've already touched on a couple of times, which is this idea of deep contextual targeting. So really being able to target ads much more in a much higher level of relevance to their context. That gives you new tools in the drive to have brand safety, for example. So your targeting algorithm can tell the difference between a story about a Boeing aircraft and another story about a Boeing aircraft that's crashed, killing a whole bunch of people, so that you don't advertise vacations alongside the second story. And those techniques to do that deep contextual targeting are fundamentally the same as a lot of the core technology inside of generative AI. So it's around what we call semantic indexing, so going in and parsing the content of those sites to build a structured representation of the content, which you can then match to the sentiment of the ads you're choosing to show. The other side of the coin, though, the other big thing is campaign and creative optimization, and there's been techniques in this area for quite a while. So dynamic creative optimization has been a thing for ages, and there's quite a lot of well-evolved solutions for doing things like inserting locally relevant content into ads, so that you have one ad created, but it has an overlay for the local store that you're trying to drive people to, with hyper local targeted advertising and that sort of thing, and using combinatorial techniques to create variants and so on, and then test those variants to see which ad combinations or ad creative variants actually work. But one of the big impediments to that historically has always been the creating of the variants in the first place. And I remember, we ran a test with some technology to do this again back when I was at Microsoft, and we had a platform we were working with which said, hey, if you can give us 10 times as many ad variants, we can drive performance. This sort of iterative optimization algorithm that we have, this cool piece of technology, of AI, we can drive better performance. So we turned around to the agency and said, can we have 10 times as much creative? And they said, of course, it's just going to cost you 10 times as much money. And we're like, oh crap, okay, well maybe we'll think about this differently. But now using Gen AI, and we're not talking, by the way, when people think about Gen AI creative, they're thinking about typing in happy young person holding a bottle of Coca-Cola, and the magic ad will come out. That is not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is dynamically recompositing ads, putting in new backgrounds, changing time of day, lighting, the color of a vehicle, the color of other elements in the image, generating lots and lots of different versions of taglines and other ad copy and so on. So you end up with something that you can vary thousands of ways, and then treat that as a giant experiment to delivering that across the audience, cross-referencing it with what about the audience and other environmental or kind of targeting or contextual attributes, and then picking the winners on a continuous kind of iterative basis. And so that can drive, you can achieve a lot of what I've just described, almost all of what I've just described, without using any kind of identifiers for the audience. Certainly some of the tracking will need to kind of pass through things like Privacy Sandbox, because that, even ad tracking and conversion measurement, it needs to be kind of go through those environments now. But there's a lot of opportunity there. And the interesting thing is that, as I say, it's not just the kind of, the sort of high profile, like, type in your ad, it pops out thing, but it's the same fundamental technology as used to generate these things. I think it would support this kind of experimentation-based approach.
Got it. Thank you. Look, I know you spend a lot of your time now advising companies on how to build, grow, make more successful their data organizations. When you think about the current skills that are needed in a data science team these days, talk to me about the need to pull the data versus structure the queries versus sophisticated analysis versus soft skills like working with other teams. What's your sort of perfect team mix or skill mix look like now?
Yeah, well, I frequently say to people, data science is really a team sport. The sort of the mythos of this, this data scientist, this genius data scientist who lives in a darkened office and occasionally emerges, waving a piece of paper with an amazing algorithm on it, is, that was never really a thing outside the big tech firms, and we already talked about the bad example they'd set. So in order to have an effective data team, you need people to manage data through the whole of what I would call the data value chain. So you need a fairly, a group of people who essentially think and operate like engineers, who take care of sourcing the data from wherever it's coming from, bringing it in, storing it, and structuring it in a scalable way in some kind of appropriate platform, which they also manage like a proper kind of product platform. And then you need a set of people who can think a bit like engineers, but also think a little bit like analysts. And sometimes these people are referred to as analytics engineers, and they're slightly unicorny people. You have to not get too hung up on exactly the right mix of skills, but these are people who are really good at understanding business context around reporting and analytics scenarios and what might be needed for data science, but who understand enough about the underlying data to be able to structure the data in that way, or in a way that's going to be able to serve those requirements. And the whole industry has grown up around analytics engineers. There's an analytics engineering platform called DBT, which now runs one of the biggest conferences in the industry, really focusing on that really essential kind of switchboarding type of activity. And then you've got data scientists and analysts who who are servicing sort of day-to-day servicing stakeholder requirements and building capabilities and thinking about that in a kind of productized way. So one of the things I preach a lot is the idea of data product management. Back when you and I were working together at Microsoft, the Microsoft internal tool that I was running, we ran it like a product. We had a release schedule for it. We had release notes. We had documentation. We had onboarding. If we had a disruptive change, we would carry people, through that change and so on. And a lot of that rigor around providing data as a product internally is still very poorly evolved within organizations. So some team will be like, oh, we made a database, you can go query it for cool stuff. And then you go in and it's completely different and to the last time you used it. And they're like, oh yeah, we changed it. And you're like, well, did you plan on telling anybody? So that kind of thing, thinking about it like a product is really important. And then with, one big thing that underlies all of this is this idea of data ops and ML ops. So the data products and machine learning models and so on, this whole thing, again, if you think about them as products, they have a life cycle. They're in development, they're in testing, they go into production, they go into, they're being maintained. They might need to be retired, particularly machine learning models might need to be retired and replaced with new ones. So there's a whole process piece there, which again gets kind of missed when people think about what a data team does. They kind of think of just of smart people writing SQL queries or writing code in Python, but there's actually a whole sort of ML data ops piece there, which shares a lot of common characteristics with the DevOps discipline that's really grown up a lot in engineering teams. So it's a really interesting mix of people in a data team typically.
Yeah. As we start to sort of come to the end of our time together, Ian, maybe this is a summary type question, but when you think, what are the sort of top 2 or 3 things that companies get wrong when they're trying to build an analytics function within digital media?
Yeah, I think the first one I would say is number one is starting with the tech rather than the business problem. We talked about this earlier of somebody going, oh, I'm running a project to implement Snowflake. Like, okay, sure, but like, why are you putting Snowflake in? What are the business problems? Because they can become very self-defining, where the outcome, people are like, what's the business outcome? And the business outcome ends up being like, oh, well, the business outcome is we've got Snowflake. So congratulations, you've got more technology to support. That's not a business outcome. So that's a very common problem I see across lots of businesses, including digital media businesses. And the second one is particularly in a sort of digital and media context is operating in silos. So particularly marketing teams not involving or not working properly with the tech and data team, and that results in people setting up separate stacks to do work around particularly around customer data platforms and other kind of campaign analytics type things. And I get it. If you're a marketing team, and I've seen this play out so many times, that you're somebody in a marketing team and they can't articulate what they need in a way that the technology of the engineering team understands, and the technology team can't ask questions of the marketing team in a way the marketing team understands. And often it's the role of the data team, in my experience, to mediate between those two organizations, so that the data is made available to support what the marketing team needs, and the marketing requirements are kind of translated into ways that can be implemented by engineers. So working in silos is a real challenge. And then the third one I see people get wrong a lot is just looking in the rearview mirror. So a lot of campaign analysis is still people sitting down at the end of a campaign and looking at a bunch of dashboards and going, how did the campaign do? With this sort of faith-based expectation that just by looking at some numbers about the campaign, that the next one will somehow be better. And really you need to flip that on its head and say, okay, look, we're going to be investing this money in these marketing campaigns. We have decided we want to drive this specific outcome. Like, pick one. Like, is it conversions? Is it exposure, is it brand awareness, is it clicks, whatever it is, but pick the outcome you're trying to drive, and then stick to that, and sort of optimize against it so that you're doing what I would call kind of good science. So all the decisions you take are against the outcome you're trying to drive, and that inability to look forward to make decisions about what will happen in the future rather than just looking back and looking at a bunch of numbers. But it's still very, very difficult, because unless people have a good understanding of what, unless they can be rigorous about the outcome they're trying to drive, you can't really look forward because you don't know the direction you're trying to go in. So that's a real kind of data maturity thing that I help a lot of my clients with.
Ian, it has been an absolute pleasure to catch up with you. As we come to a close, are there any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, apart from, as I said, it's been great to catch up with you. It's been, I can't remember how many years since we had a good chat. But I think it's a really, as I said earlier, a really interesting time to be in the digital media and advertising industry at the moment. I think a few years from now, we'll look back and we'll be amazed at the journey that the industry's been able to reinvent itself kind of yet again. And a lot of what's old is new again. A lot of the stuff that you and I worked on 10 years ago is kind of back in vogue. Quality content is all of a sudden king of the hill again. And I'm, as I said earlier, I'm delighted about that, because I think it could be good for publishers, good for advertisers, and actually good for us suckers actually having to use the internet on a day-to-day basis.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ian. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks, James.